Hello, this is Noshat from RSA. Today I'd like to cover the topic of meta-entities within NetWitness. The link to this document that I'm referencing now will be posted in the video description. The video is going to be broken down into two sections: concepts and understanding of how meta-entities are designed and work, and then a real-world practical example within NetWitness of how they look and feel, and how you can leverage them as an analyst. A meta-entity is a way for an analyst to be agnostic about context. They are a way to abstract a high-level view of data without having to know the granular details. Let's explain a bit further by describing the value they provide to the analyst experience. How many times have you wanted to search for an IP address, but didn't care if it was a source, dest, or even an alias IP, which is typically where data is stored when directionality can be ascertained? That's exactly where meta-entity functionality fits in. Rather than searching for ip.source or ip.dest, you can search for ip.all, a pointer or an entity that points to other keys of that same data type. Here's a list of all of the meta-entities that are out of the box shipped with NetWitness and the subset of keys that they comprise. As you can see, they all have the .all suffix. So domain.all is a combination or a subset of domain.dest, domain.source, and domain. So all of these keys that are text will be searched when NetWitness analyst searches for domain.all equals some value. Again, it's a high-level way to abstract yourself away from the details of how a parser may be implemented and ask the general question. And then you can dig into the session and find the details at a granular level when you need to write an ESA rule or report or something of that nature. We'll get into that later in this video. Before we get into the details of how it looks and feels within NetWitness, let's cover some guidelines around how meta-entities are created and exist within NetWitness. Let's go through these 4 items as they are very important to understand the concept of meta-entities. Meta-entities were implemented in 11.1 and above. That is, you must be on a version 11.1 or higher to have meta-entity support. Pretty straightforward. Item number 2 states, all meta keys defined under a meta-entity should have the same data type. As you notice, these are all text types that are under domain.all. eth.all has all MAC types. ip.all has IPv4 types. So if you were to add, and we'll show this later in the practical session, if you were to add another key under host.all, a custom key that you've created that you want it to be searchable through this meta-entity, or an existing key that we have not added out of the box, it must be the same data type. That is, you cannot take ip.source and put that key into host.all meta key because of the differing data types. So the data types must match for all of the subset keys that are in the hierarchy of meta-entity. Item 3 states, all meta keys defined under a meta-entity should have the same indexing levels. That is, if you have a key set to index keys or index values, in the case of most of your keys are going to be set to index values if you're truly searching on them. Index keys only allow you to do it exist or not exist. And we're not going to cover indexing in detail in this video. But the point of item number 3 is that they must have the same index levels. Now there are only 3 index levels, none, keys, and value. So typically you're not going to have an issue managing them. But just be aware that any key that you add as a subset into an existing meta-entity or a new grouping that you create must all have the same indexing type. Item number 4, meta key nesting is not allowed. A meta key can only have a reference meta keys and not another meta entity. So what does that mean? There can only be a single hierarchy, that is meta entity to a subset of meta keys, and not a meta entity to another meta entity. However, if you need a functionality to break down further a higher level set of keys, so let's look at port.source as an example. Typically, when you have port.source.all as a meta entity for all of your source ports, and then all of the dest ports, if you cannot add this meta key entity under another meta entity. Therefore, there's no nesting capability. So one way to get around that is is an example shown here. Port.source.all has all of the source port meta keys. Port.dest.all has all of the dest meta keys. And then you can create another meta entity called port.all, which this one's out of the box, that has all of the port items already listed that are included from source, dest, and a few others. So although nesting is not allowed, it can easily be, the functionality can be gained by adding a new meta entity or adding keys into an existing meta entity and extending it. One of the limitations of meta entities is that the key itself does not actually hold data. It is simply a reference pointer, a convenience function, if you will, for analysts to be able to search and be agnostic to the data set underlying, but eventually get to the session that they're looking for. So let's dig into NetWitness and see how meta entities work. So let's look at where they are first defined. So under a concentrator, if I go to View Config, Files, and of course you can override them in your custom, but I'm going to go look at the out-of-the-box concentrator index. And if I scroll all the way down, you can see all the meta entity keys that have been defined here. And the format is you describe the entity description with the name, and then all of the keys that you want to be referenced to that entity. And after you restart the service or save your index, these values will be available and this key will be available for you to search on. Custom keys and keys that we have not added can be added under the ones that are already out of the box, or you can create new meta entities, but be sure to do that in the custom file. So for example, if I wanted to come into and find my user, so for example, let's say I wanted to add a custom key or even an out-of-the-box key into user.all, I can come into the concentrator custom file, paste in the existing content, copy one of the lines, and put in my key here, username. Now let's look at how the data looks like in investigation. All of the keys have a description of all and then some text keys, so all domain keys, all port keys, so on and so forth. So for example, the domain key covers all of the domain's text meta keys, domain, domain source, domain dest. So let's go and add the domain keys so we can compare and contrast. So we'll add domain dest, domain, and domain source into our list. Now notice that I have a source domain of googleusercontent.com, a destination with some domains, and then here's my domain all. All of these are going to be session for session match with the list that is in here. So for example, all domain keys, I have 6 sessions total that are referenced in domain.all for googleusercontent.com. 5 of those happen to be in domain dest, and 1 of them happens to be in domain source. And notice that now domain all is a great way to aggregate. So I can actually come in here and query domain.all contains Google. And now I've got my sessions, 6 that are comprised of in the all key and referenced by it, but I can see the individual breakdown. Now let's go ahead and look at the data within the session. If I click on View Meta, you can see that the domain dest is usercontent.com. Notice that I've so far not searched for domain dest directly, but I've used the meta key. However, I'm still able to get to my session. Notice also that the .all key is not in the session. This is an interpretation of how the metadata database is storing each session. So for this particular session ID, there is no .all key. Domain.all key does not exist in this meta session. That is an important note to be aware of, that the data itself is not stored in the meta entity. The data still resides in the meta keys directly and indexed and all of that per your administrative configurations. but the meta entity itself does not have any data itself. Therefore, if I were to make an alert in ESA based off of this session and I was looking for certain pieces of information, I would have to refer to and reference this. So again, the concept of meta entities is a convenience function for an analyst to abstract themselves away from the granular data. At this point, I did not know where Google would be stored from a domain perspective. There's so many parsers in my environment, so many people writing parsers within my organization, and they may choose to put something in desk, source, or just domain because they don't know directionality. I abstracted myself away from that by searching specifically for domain.all contains Google. So I didn't have to worry about the details of the source, desk, or non-directionality. And I was still able to get to my session. And now that I actually have the data I can work with and see that these are the sessions of interest to me for a particular alert that I may want to create, I now know that that data is typically stored in domain.dest. And I can use that key for my alerting purposes. I hope you found this video useful. Please leave comments or questions below.